Unconventional Soldier, a military podcast brought to you by two British Army veterans in association with ISAR.com.
Welcome everyone, and thanks for downloading another episode of the podcast. Our guest today is retired US Marine and author of Terror to Triumph, Chris Whittemore. Chris served as a sniper in Ramadi and Fallujah in Iraq in 2005 and 2007. He then retained as a UH-1 crew chief and door gunner and completed a tour of Helmand province in that role in 2010. Chris' book outlines his tours in both countries and his adjustment to the civilian world on leaving the Marines, whilst continuing to deal with his PTSD, which he developed as a result of his service. It is a story of how Chris and his family went through each deployment, dealing with the trauma and death, and finally finding success against the odds. So Chris, thanks for coming to the podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about your childhood, any sort of previous service in the family, and what made you become a Marine?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks again for having me on here and making this work. Basically, I grew up in a military family. All the men in my family all served, whether it be in the Army, the Navy. They were real active in Vietnam and the different branches. The biggest factor for me was definitely my grandfather, who was in the Navy in Hawaii during the bombings in 41 that jump-started all that stuff. And he actually was a Silver Star winner during that whole event. You know, when the time came, I knew I wanted to be in the military. It was kind of a pathway, kind of like, hey, everyone else is in the military, you're going to join the military whether you like it or not, kind of thing. But I knew that I didn't want to float around on a boat. I knew I didn't want to be in the Army. And for as long as I could remember, my mother always reminds me, she's like, oh, the first time you saw the Marines in their dress uniform, you were hooked, line and sinker. So I always looked at them as being the best, the hardest, something I always kind of followed in my own life. I was like, well, if it's the hardest, that's what I want to do. And so I ended up joining the Marines. The first 4 years were great. You know, got to be stationed in Hawaii as well on the same base my grandfather was in. You know, got out and rejoined in '04, but it's been, it was just kind of a bouncing around military kid.
And did your grandfather talk about Pearl Harbor, and did your uncle was a paratrooper in Vietnam, did both of them talk about the service to you at all?
You know, I really wish they would have back then growing up. I was kind of mentioned in the book as well. I was like, well, you know, why don't they share their stories? Why don't they, you know, it's kind of like their little, not their brag sheet, but their kind of rite of passage a little bit. They never would, though, especially not my grandfather. He was very, very hush. If we ever asked him about something, he would either change the subject or just walk away. My uncles who were in the Army or in the Navy during Vietnam wouldn't talk about anything. And it really kind of bugged me. To me, it felt, you know what, they don't want to talk about it. There must be, you know, maybe it's so long ago they just don't remember certain facts or aspects of it. Ironically, after my experiences during the different deployments, people will ask me like, hey, what about this event, or what about this, or something, you know, tell us about Iraq in '05 or something like that. It's weird that it's like going back in time. I just kind of, oh, you know, how about that sporting game, or how about that, you know, man, it's hot outside. And I completely changed the subject. Looking back at it, I sometimes will laugh. I'm like, wow, now I kind of understand. It's not that they don't or we don't want to discuss what happened. It's just like we're kind of maybe protecting, in a way, the people who didn't live through it. We're trying to protect them from some of the horrors, and we don't want to unload our stuff onto them.
There's probably an element of protecting yourself as well, isn't there?
Yeah, I think so, because which kind of leads into what we were talking about before we started recording, though, but it kind of leads into this huge number that's being created here and over there as well, with people who don't talk about it. They bottle it up so much that it's kind of like shaking a bottle of Coke, you know, with a lot of carbonation. It's eventually it's got to go somewhere. And usually it doesn't just fizzle out. It just expands. And, you know, when you press that relief button, it's never a good thing.
Do you think maybe it's because if they haven't shared that experience, it's very difficult to get that across to them? But if you talk to your friends who you serve with, you can relate all the stories, you can talk about it, you understand it more. But when you're trying to explain to someone who's never been there, never experienced it, it's twice as hard you can't get across what operations are like.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I think, like, you know, sitting around at the, you know, having a barbecue or having a, you know, get together with friends, it's easy, but even then it's such a different tone of voice too. Like when you're talking about it, you kind of try and laugh it off a little bit. Some of the stuff you're like, oh, that was funny. And in reality, most people are thinking like, funny, what is wrong with these people? Like, what is funny about that? It's kind of the that relief valve. Like laughter is, and I've kind of learned this as I've gone along, laughter is kind of the best medicine, where if you can laugh about it and process it that way, where laughter is happy for the most part, it's a good way to let that pressure out. Yeah, it's just weird, the camaraderie that occurs over there. Then you don't talk to these people for, I don't know, 10 plus years, and now all of a sudden here they are and you're talking again. It's kind of like not a day has passed by. It's kind of strange, but
I think it's quite unique among service people, because you and I had a video conference call before we started recording this one, just to see how we both got on and were we both suitable for this conversation. But we clicked within about 5 minutes. And initially I was dreading talking to you, going, what if we don't get on? But, we're 2 countries apart. I was Army, you were Marines, separated by common language, American and English.
Scottish.
I think that's Scottish, yes, Scottish. But that service bond, we had no problem talking to each other, and there's a lot we could identify with.
You mentioned about you've been in the Marines twice. So firstly before 9/11, and then after that world-changing event. Can you tell us about your first enlistment and why you decided to get out?
The first 4 years in the Marines was awesome. Nothing was going on. The initial 91, 92, 3-week push into Iraq thing was done and over with long before I even joined. It was something I always wanted to do. There was no conflict. So I was like, this is going to be awesome. Me and my friend went to boot camp. I went to Hawaii. He went to Cuba as a security guard. I won that one. And being in Hawaii was great. It was the first experience. It was kind of a what would you call it, a quick way to grow up. It's no more mom, dad, to the rescue. It was, hey, you're on your own. Here's the bills. You're either going to grow up or they'll destroy you. During that enlistment was exciting. We went to Mount Fuji, Japan, Korea, Okinawa, Japan, up and down the coast. It was just great. The second deployment was a little different. We were all set, and over there we had the pagers way back in the day before like all this cool technology. And every time it would go off, we'd have to go stand in formation. It was accountability. We were like a quick reaction force for if something happened, which nothing was going on. So we were like, okay, cool, whatever. Let's go stand in formation and have some fun. We had all our gear staged. We were getting ready to go back to Hawaii. I was on my the last deployment. I was only probably, a year and a half out from getting out the first time. All kicking back, having fun, laughing, joking. And all of a sudden the pager goes off. We ended up walking over to the formation. We're like, okay, this is stupid, but we're going home, so who cares? What's another 10 minutes, waiting on the bus anyway? Well, we get over there and they tell us, you guys are the only ones trained. You guys need to go over there, get your stuff off the pallet. There's stuff going on in Cambodia back then in 97. We're going over there. And we're like, wait, no, we're going home. We're going back to Hawaii. They're like, you have 15 minutes, go. We ended up going to Thailand. And during that time in Cambodia, it was kind of like the movie Tears of the Sun in a way. There was a big uprising in Cambodia. The royal family had been killed and held up in a hotel with a bunch of Americans. So we ended up deploying over to Thailand, right along the border of Cambodia. And we were able to be with some great company. A SEAL team was there. The big Army 1-1 was there. And of course, we were only over there for a few weeks. And, we definitely did some things that ironically are not in any of the books. It's kind of like it didn't happen, which anyone who was there knows it happened. But it's kind of like, you did it, cool, but we're not going to add that in there, and which was fine. After I got out in 1999, I ended up meeting my wife of 22 years now, moved down to Houston, Texas, did a lot of different jobs. I ended up becoming a Texas State Trooper up in Tyler, Texas, where I did a lot of death notifications, accidents, things like that. They were absolutely disturbing. But of course, right after I got out in 99, everything was still very simple compared to how it is now. And of course, we all remember where we were, what we were doing, what was going on September 11th, which was such a seismic shift in the country. Just everything completely changed. Like one of my youngest nieces just graduated college. They were born in 2001. and they know about it because it's all over the place. I constantly talk to my wife about this. I was like, there's a lot of people like our generation who wasn't alive during Pearl Harbor. They know about it, but they didn't live through it. Watching everything live on TV, hearing all the news reports, seeing, the people jumping or falling from the buildings, things like that. This younger generation has no idea about 9/11. They see it like we see Pearl Harbor.
They've lived with the consequences, but they've never really that step change that those attacks on the Twin Towers caused. Even now I can look at footage of the Twin Towers and I still find it horrific.
For sure. I just still can't believe it really happened. And it's kind of like all that stuff, though, the 9/11 Oklahoma City bombing, like all these horrific events that have occurred during like our generation per se. In my mind, in the battles and Iraq, Afghanistan, things like that. And I can't help but wonder and hope this younger generation learns something. And these kind of events, 20 years or whatever we were in Iraq or Afghanistan, by far the longest war that I think the U.S. has been involved in. And I'm just hoping, I hope this new generation does not have to go through what we've gone through.
Well, there was an argument, wasn't there? I mean, it's a whole different podcast in itself, that really the West and America should have taken a pause for breath before they launched into the so-called war on terror.
Yeah.
And by taking a breath, maybe another response would have been formulated with a clearer head. But we are where we are, and I think it's a good moment in the podcast just to remind people that the war in Iraq, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, it seems to have been overshadowed by the war in Afghanistan. But
definitely.
But the casualties in both theatres for the American military was significant, and it's worth remembering these sacrifices. And the following figures I'm about to spout are from the US Department of Defense. So Afghanistan, you had 4,418 killed in action and in accidents, and of that 4,418, 3,481 were KIA, and 31,994 wounded in action. And again, people forget, if you're in a contact in Afghanistan or Iraq and it's one soldier or one Marine reported death, you can guarantee there's 5 or 6 seriously injured with life-changing injuries in that contact, generally speaking. In Iraq, in American forces, there's 2,218 killed in accidents and in action, with 1,833 of those killed in action solely. And again, another 20,093 wounded in action. So colossal figures, even for a big country like America.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And being in both, I don't want to call them battles, but being in both countries at various times and during significant events, looking back, I still can't believe Ramadi 2005. I mean, that was 17, almost 18 years ago. But even after all this time that has passed from 2005 to date, there's so many that have come back from Iraq and Afghanistan, but they haven't come back. They're still there, or they're no longer around. And it's just such a staggering statistic fact. Although it may be the longest war, it's not the first one. I hope it's the last one, but let's be real. It's not going to be the last one. But yet we're still making the same mistakes with people returning that we did in World War I, World War II.
I saw a very interesting podcast. If I can find the link, I'll put it on the podcast notes. But there's an American academic talking about post-traumatic stress. And she said about how it's changed over 100 years. And she was saying that she doesn't call it post-traumatic stress disorder. She just calls it post-traumatic stress, because calling it a disorder implies that your reaction to a stressful event shouldn't be there, so she's taking the disorder out, so she just calls it PTSD. And she divided it into two, actually. She was saying that in her mind, in the modern world, you have PTS, post-traumatic stress, and she has something she calls moral trauma. And she's saying that PTS can be from being bombed, shelled, shot at. And she's saying increasingly, though, she sees people with moral trauma PTS, and that's where somebody's seen a child getting killed, or they've called in an airstrike on a building that's resulted in the death of a family. And moral trauma can also come about from fighting the wrong war, if that makes sense. You're in Afghanistan and you wonder, why the hell are we here? And whereas if you fought in World War II, that was far more definitive, wasn't it?
Well, I suppose if you come back and the public and the political will has changed direction, then you're seen as being fighting an unjust war, then you start feeling guilt from that. And I think if you look at Vietnam, was probably the example where At the beginning, everyone was very supportive, but when people came back towards the end in the late 60s and 70s, public opinion had changed massively.
They're called baby killers at the airports
and they looked at soldiers in a different light. Yet it wasn't the soldiers' fault. They just went off. They were conscripted or they volunteered, but it wasn't. The politicians didn't take that responsibility, and they left the guilt was left on the forces, not on the politicians.
But I also think you can go to a conflict zone and you can go out there full of high ideals, but at the end of the day, those get drummed out of you quite quickly, and a lot of time it comes down to you're fighting for the guy on the left or the woman on the left.
Yeah.
And it's about survival, and I think a lot of time the high ideals are sort of gone quite quickly.
They can very much fade out very fast. You're excited or not excited, that's not the right word at all. You're over there, you're like, and then over a certain amount of time, for me, I think if I remember back to the book and things like that, it was probably a couple weeks, like all bets were off. Like I just want to make it through 7 months, I
want to get out of here alive. And that comes across in your book very well, actually, when I read it. It does boil down to those. All you want to do each day is eat, sleep, and survive. The first two are normally in short supply.
and I think as operations like Iraq and Afghanistan, because they were so enduring, that you were going back on tours. So the same soldiers, every 2 years, you were going back for another tour. So it's accumulative. So after a while, there is going to be that, I just want to get through the tour.
Yeah,
because I know I've got another one coming in a couple of years. I think when an operation lasts for 20 years, there's a lot of people, especially in the British Army, all they've known is Afghanistan. And they've done numerous tours out there and continued on and almost complete their whole career preparing to going, recovering from it, and getting ready to go again.
The nasty cycle that you just get trapped, not trapped in, but you're just... Yeah,
it's accumulative. Yeah. So, Chris, what motivated you to re-enlist after the events of 9/11?
Definitely after 9/11, and ironically, shortly after 9/11, my wife and I were, we were engaged for a long time, and we were both like, let's not get married, whatever. But as soon as 9/11 happened, that December, we went to Lake Tahoe, California, ended up getting married. As time progressed, I ended up joining the state troopers in 2003, right during that initial push back into Iraq, that initial, all right, here we go again. As I was sitting there going through the academy, we started with, I think, 94 people or something like that in the academy. But once those bombings started, we were all sitting around watching the TV as the planes went in and started bombing Iraq. Slowly but surely, these different guys who were in the reserves that, did the 1 week in a month, 2 weeks in the summer to keep their status going, all of a sudden started disappearing out of the class. And it dawned on me, I'm like, oh, they're on TV now. As time progressed through the academy, I still had a lot of friends who were serving in the military, and all of a sudden those names started coming back on the blotter and on the injured or the killed list. I needed to decide, I've got to focus on this, that's not my life anymore. But it's hard when you keep seeing the same people that and you're like, oh no, like what is going on? But I ended up graduating the academy, sent to a small town. And as I was working these different accidents and these death notifications on doors, I couldn't help but think, man, families are either getting death notifications from me saying their son and daughter were killed in a car accident for whatever reason. It's the same notifications as, the chaplain and these officers are doing with these families on guys coming back. I mean, it's a different thing, but it's still notifying families that they're no longer coming home. About 2004, after only about a year into being a trooper, I was like, I've got to go back in. So I think it was a sense of these guys have come back and they're hurt, killed, and they can't. But you know what? I can go over there and naively thinking, looking back, I can go over there and right the wrong, or I can go get vengeance. In reality, one person is not going to...
Is that the idealism of youth, do you think?
I think so, because I was still young and naive. But in reality, looking back, I said, you know what, I want to go back in. And I even told the recruiter, which this had to be his greatest day in the whole world. I went back in and I told him, I said, I want to rejoin the military. I don't care what job you give me, and I don't care what duty station you send me to. His mouth must have been watering coming back from Iraq after, getting a 20-pound steak. I mean, he just had to be like, you're going back in the infantry? I'm like, fine. You're going to 29 Palms. Where the heck is 29 Palms, California? And my wife asked that too. She's like, where is this? And they pulled it up on a map. They're like, right there. Oh, okay. And June of '04, I was back in, and off we went. This big unknown, just like you were saying, Kev. The cycle was deploy, come back, train for 7-8 months, and you're going right back, because it was there was only 4 infantry battalions there in 29 Palms. So every 7 months you were going to your training, you came back from a deployment, you had 3-week reset on leave or whatever, post-deployment leave, come back and immediately hit the ground running. And when I first got to 29 Palms, the unit that I joined just literally got back maybe 2 months after we got there. They went on leave, came back, and we immediately started training. And I'm thinking to myself, these guys just got back. What are we doing? Like, why are we already gearing up to go? Within a few weeks of starting that, they're like, hey, September of next year, we're not even less than a year. We're going to be deploying back to Iraq, to Ramadi. That hard reality that, okay, this isn't in the 90s when, Hawaii and deploy to, Mount Fuji and do all this training and fun stuff. This is like the new reality of the military, and it's.
But isn't that the sort of the dichotomy of being a Marine or a soldier? In peacetime you want to go to war, and then suddenly it's thrust upon you, and it's like one of those oh hell moments that actually they've called my bluff and they're sending me on operations.
Yeah, like watching them play poker on TV. It's like, oh, they got this great hand, but they're bluffing. You're exactly right.
Yeah,
it's all cool to play war, if you will, until it's time to go do the work.
You went back to 29 Palms then, and then you went off on your first tour of Ramadi in Iraq in '05. What was that like? What role were you fulfilling out in that tour?
During that time, literally right before the deployment happened, they were having a tryout for the Scout Sniper platoon. And I was like, well, I'm back in, and here comes that young youth, if you will, still. And I was like, well, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. And so I tried out for the Scout Sniper team and was selected. And then within, 5 months maybe, it was time to deploy. So we ended up deploying to Ramadi, Iraq. During that time, there's been different battles and different people have said different things about it, whether it was in '05 or '06. But when we got over there, they quickly let us know the city is blacklisted for any low-flying aircraft. They had to stay within at least 1,500 feet off the ground, at least 3 or 4 miles off out of the city, because the threat was so high. There was no elected officials. There was no government whatsoever in that city. It was kind of the Wild West. For the next 7 months, it was going to be not every day like they portray on the news or in movies. There's not battles every single day, which would, like we were talking about the first time, it'd be kind of nice if it was like that. But it was, a battle 3 or 4 days, nothing. All of a sudden something would jump off for 2 minutes, then nothing for 2 weeks. I think that in itself is such a psychological torment. If it's every single day, you're like, okay, we're going to get in battles every single day. But when it happens and then there's a pause, you allow yourself almost to like, okay, maybe it's not so, and then it's kind of like
it's up and down like a roller coaster, isn't it?
Like scaring a kid.
But your unit took casualties quite quickly, didn't it?
Yeah, it was within the first 4 days in to the deployment, and we haven't even changed out and really actually started our 7 months yet. We were just waiting to right seat, left seat with the outgoing unit, because they were going to show us the city and the routes and things like that. And right from the get-go, we heard this loud rumbling like an earthquake constantly, almost every night. And we're like, what is this? And, kind of make light of it in the book a little bit. But like you said, I don't want to give away too much. But they told us that was counter battery, and they were actually shooting out to defend the guys out in the cities. But there was that one day right from the jump, we're walking to the little cafeteria or chow hall, as we call it, normal, nice, cool September day in Iraq. The group I was with, half of them stopped to use the bathroom and to smoke on these concrete barriers. I was a big smoker back then. So I was like, well, you know what, I'll stop as well. And then, you know what, no, I'm going to stay with my friends. So I kept walking to the chow hall. Well, about right as we're opening the door, we heard this big, loud explosion again. We're like, okay, good on the, whoever's getting protected out there. It's too bad for the enemy, but, it's them or us. So we eat thinking nothing of it until we get back and find out that all those Marines that we knew, they had stopped right there on that concrete barrier, a indirect rocket had come into onto base and detonated right next to the barrier, killing or wounding some very close guys to us within our company, but also I think wounding probably 20 at least through shrapnel,
Wow.
losing limbs. Swanberg, one of the guys who was really known to everyone within the group I was with, ended up thankfully dying instantly. We didn't have to suffer, but the rocket hit right basically in the center of them, and there was nothing to collect. It happened instantly. There was no warnings, and I think that started the mindset of it doesn't matter where you are within the city or on this big base. From that point forward was that jump start into, you know what, it doesn't matter if you're here, if you're sleeping, if you're eating, if there's nowhere that's safe.
And that's a psychological strain, because normally it's always nice to come back to a safe haven, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
But knowing that I'm only in danger when I step out those gates, but when you can't even rest and you're constantly on edge for it. Funnily enough, in preparation for this podcast for you, Chris, Kev and I were talking. Kev and I both worked as civilians in Iraq. We both took more IDF fire as civilians than we ever did in our military careers when we were deployed in operations, because the IDF in Iraq at the time, some of the bases were getting hit 15, 20 times a day in the south. I presume that was the same in the north.
But we had, what do you call them, like the porta-johns on base. And,
the local nationals.
Yeah, and they would come on and clean them. I cannot help but think like the movie 13 Hours, the Benghazi thing, like where that guy would come up and it looked like he was taking pictures, or it looks like they were cleaning the porta-johns 5 minutes, 10 minutes after they left. Here comes the IDF. And I'm just like, why are we not, linking this together? There's security with them, and we made sure that they're not, writing anything down, or don't have a GPS. How hard is it to take this cell phone, hide it under a seat, and it's going to give you the coordinates where you were. Sadly as well, in 2005, and I think like we talked about, if you're deployed and you lose a service member, it's obviously a horrible thing, but it's not something that you kind of know is going to happen, if you will. But when the kids get involved in it, that's a whole nother thing. And during that time, the insurgents were using kids with poles and white rags, like sheets. They would stand on the roofs of these buildings and would guide in the IDF by like how they would move their hands or move the flags. That's how they would adjust shooting these IDF rockets into these bases. And right from the get-go, they told us, if you see a kid on the roof doing this, they are a priority target and they need to be taken out. And these kids probably weren't 12 to 14 years old. They didn't know any better. Well, I think they know better, but they don't have a choice. They're like, you're either going to do this or we're going to kill your whole family. So of course, they're going to have to do that. Luckily, we never saw that when we were out on missions, because who knows what kind of mess I would be, if that was the case. But they told us right from the get-go, like, hey, these are priority targets. We had to quickly process it to where it's like, yes, they're kids. If we don't stop that, there's 20 plus Americans at least that are not going to, make it home. So it's such a psychological thing. It's so hard to put into words like what that torment is, knowing that
you must be grateful that's a test you never had to come up against. But there was, reading in your book, Chris, there was an incident with a child that sort of left a mark on you. Are you okay to talk about that?
Some of the other podcasts, this has been kind of like one of those topics that usually gets brought up, and it's definitely one of those ones that stick with me the most. Even writing the book, by far the hardest. During a recent interview too, they asked, what was your worst day in the military? And that story always comes to mind. And the person who was interviewing me that asked that actually kind of brought a tear to their eye. And I'm like, wow, I've never made someone cry during an interview. This is a little weird. We ended up taking over a house with a phenomenal family. The husband was super intelligent, been to a few colleges. He had like quantum physics books. And I mean, he was just the smartest guy ever. And of course, over there, they've got the husband's got a bunch of wives, bunch of kids, things like that. So we took over their house. We moved them all into one room for ease of just controlling them. And they were great, though. I mean, they're like, okay, sure. They went into the room. They're like, hey, can we lay back down? And we're like, by all means, please. It's 3 a.m. We're sorry we had to wake you up. but we're only going to be here 3 days and we'll leave. And so during the events, they would feed us, offer us food, things to drink, chai tea. They were great. I mean, it was kind of like just being over at your uncle's house. One night, I'll never forget though, I'm on watch and they set up this big, giant, comfortable chair for us even. So we're not sitting on the concrete floor with the Claymore clackers guarding the doors. And all of a sudden there's this noise behind me. And I spin around with my pistol, like, how did someone get in without warning devices? And here's this little girl, maybe 8 years old, maybe if not younger, standing there with this raggedy bear that looks like it went through about 400 mud puddles and dried up bear and this raggedy blanket. I don't know if she just was like, hey, this is my chair, get out, or if something startled her. So I stood up and she ended up crawling into the chair, curling up with the animal, the blanket, right back to sleep. And each person who came on shift, that little girl just stayed there. Like she felt safe to do that. But as the sun came up on the last day, she would get up, run back into her room. Our 3 days were up. We left. A few weeks later, we decided to come back to that house because there was a lot of IEDs getting planted with a great field of view from the second story of this building. When we get back there about 3 a.m, we're kind of naively excited. We're like, oh, this family's so cool. We're not going to be sleeping on concrete and like rats and rodents running around the floors. I mean, it's going to be a normal warm house. Well, we get back there, kind of when you approach a place or you go into somewhere and you just kind of get that sickly feeling in your stomach. There's something weird here. Something's just not right. So we start waking up the family and here comes the man of the house and he's limping. Okay, who knows? But I mean, in Iraq, who knows what could have happened? And then here comes one wife. Here comes another wife. And we're like, okay. And then here comes their oldest daughter, who was probably 17 or 8. I mean, she was basically a full-grown woman. Where's the rest of your family? Like, are they in another house? Do we need to worry about them coming back? And he just looked down. And he didn't even have to say it. We kind of just knew. As it turned out, about 3 days after we left, the insurgents showed up. They found out because they were everywhere. I mean, this house was here. Each one of those houses maybe had an insurgent or was related to an insurgent, or just there was a link. So regardless, they found out that we had taken over their house or that the dad had allowed us to be there. And, we engaged a few insurgents that were planning IEDs and, took them out. So I'm sure it hurt their cause. They showed up, beat the man of the house, killed one of his wives. To make it even worse, they took this little girl out into the street in front of the entire neighborhood with everyone out in the street and executed her in the street and killed her as a lesson to all these other people. Like, if you're here, this is what's going to happen if you allow the U.S. service members to take over your house. And what's so horrible is not like we gave them a choice. I mean, we're not going to say, hey, can we borrow your house for 3 days? We told them, hey, we're going to take over your house and we'll be here 3 days and then we'll leave. As soon as we heard that, all the life and the wind, I mean, it's like getting punched in the stomach like 20 times. I mean, everyone was just felt sick. And the guy's like, we'll go in here. You guys can take over the house. And we said, no, and we called in for the QRF, our ride, basically. I was like, hey, you need to come back and get us. We're actively compromised, whatever the case might be, this is in a safe place. And they took us back to base. Platoon sergeant was like, what happened? And we told him, and he's like, all right, you guys are off for the next 13 hours. You guys will go back out that next night. And we're like, oh, 13 hours, thanks. Back then, 13 hours was like, woohoo. We had a break. Yeah, the very next night, we went back out to another house. But
do you reckon that incident would fit into that sort of moral trauma piece that we were talking about earlier on? Did it affect you that badly?
Yeah, I think it definitely affected me and a lot of the guys that were part of that. And I think the moral aspect of it in the internal battle of, oh my God, we were there. The end result was this little kid got killed. In our minds, she was killed because we were there. In reality, it's not because we were there. It's because of the insurgents and their horrible mind where they think it's justified to kill these kids in a way of gaining power and control over these people.
Ruling by fear, isn't it?
Yes,
yeah, absolutely. And I've gotten a lot better. And after writing the book and talking with people over the last 17 years, I've gotten a lot better with this. I had to accept and go against it wasn't a moral thing where I killed the kid. It was they killed this little girl and we were there to do a job. But in reality, so it's it's
Yeah.
still
You guys didn't kill that child. They killed that child. But I can see what you're wrestling with internally. You know, it's far easier because you've got your own set of morals. That's why you wrestle with it so hard.
like soldier on soldier, fine, whatever. But to kill a kid, I mean, it's like there's something. There has to be no moral compass, or that compass is so messed up they couldn't even find their way to a parking lot.
So, Chris, when you returned home from Iraq, you were beginning to experience PTSD, but felt compelled to go out to Iraq once more. How did you recognise PTSD in yourself, and why did you go again? What compelled you?
Great question. Coming back initially in 2006, I had no idea what PTSD, whatever the acronym is now, what it was. I knew something must have been wrong, but I didn't recognize it. I think it was you come home, all right, I'm not sleeping, and you rationalize and say, oh, it's because the different time zones, or I can't sleep, so I'm going to drink or take sleeping pills. Then it becomes a routine where you almost think you rationalize it in your head, where you're like, oh, I can't sleep, but if I drink myself to sleep, then I'm actually getting rest. But there's nothing wrong with me, but I don't want to actually go out and be in public. I don't want to be around people. I don't want to be outside of this safe haven, if you will, you know, like where you want to come back after a mission, like, okay, I'm safe. Whew, I can decompress. But I also, looking back, I was the expert at once you left the comforts or the safety of your house, you know, you go out into public and everyone's like, man, yeah, you're looking good. You're doing great. Seeing my family, they're like, oh, welcome back. Woohoo. You know, everything's great. And I'm laughing it off, having a good time and thinking to myself, man, I've got like the perfect Halloween mask that I can pull over my face and put on this fake swagger, if you will, to the rest of the world. And I'm like, oh, look, I'm great. But as soon as you get back to your house and your safe haven, it's just an emotional dump. As that vicious cycle kept occurring, my wife was getting more and more worried about me because I would either be drinking, I would sit in my room, I wouldn't talk, I would just be like internalizing everything. And she's like, man, there's something wrong. And I'm like, no, I'm just readjusting. Leave me alone. It's you don't know what you're talking about. You weren't over there. You know, all that different stuff. And was wrestling with this. I said, you know what? I'm happier, as crazy as this sounds, I'm happier getting shot at and dodging IDF. So I can either stay here and be miserable all the time, or I can redeploy and feel at home, as weird as that sounds. And so my struggle was, hey, we just got back. Yeah, we're ramping up, but we're not going to deploy for another, 7-8 months to a year. Well, we're in what, March, April, May or June time frame. I said, oh, the next battalion is leaving in January. I can jump over with them and immediately get back there, and I only have to wait maybe a third of the time versus what the unit I just was with. And so I made the move over there. I was back to that mindset of, I was so angry at all the people who were killed over there that I was like, I'm going to go back and seek retribution for them and their families. I'm going to go back and right the wrongs of everything. I was really hoping that we were going to go back to Ramadi, because I'm like, oh, you know what? I know this place. I know all the, good spots to not be and things like that. And they ended up flipping the script and saying, nope, you guys are going to Fallujah, outside of Fallujah. But it was more of I had to find some place of peace. And I knew where most people find peace, being home, like in the States, or, where you've grown up or lived, is normally that good place. For me, I was like, I can't keep going at this crazy pace of being so unhappy and ruining myself, my family, my isolating away from friends. So I made the choice and ended up redeploying into Iraq in 2007, which was, another tormenting time. I deployed, I was happy, but back here in the States, my wife ended up losing her grandfather, who she was super close to, and a lot of other things occurred throughout, the different time of the deployment. And it's just, and there was another moral struggle. It's, hey, I'm happy, but you know what? Everyone else over here is miserable. So, and everyone's like, well, why didn't you comfort the person back here? It's like, well, how do you comfort someone in the States when you're thousands of miles away, when you're worried about walking to get some food or the IDF or just anything? I mean, there's you want to take care of the people, but if I worry about this, I'm missing the bigger picture. And I think it was, definitely more about that. I think it was just redeploying and getting back to a happy place.
Or what you thought would be a happy place.
Yes,
It's probably a bit. And I think we alluded to it earlier. Deploying on operations, your life is simple. You don't have to worry about trivia like paying the bills and all those other things that you have back in the civilian world. You go out there, and as we alluded to, it's you eat, you try and get some sleep, and you go and do your job. And it's boiled down to those three things.
Yep.
And you don't have any of the trivia and baggage that you have back stateside. Is another aspect of operations, I think, that, I don't know, I'm not explaining myself very well, but it can be a very simple life, even though it has all those complications that we talked about.
It's addictive as well. You can become addicted to operations, and you don't know why.
Adrenaline rush.
Yeah, well, I think that becomes the normal.
Yeah,
and then
it does.
Going back home, you try to resettle. You just can't get back into the sync as you was before the operation.
There's obviously more about that tour in your book, Chris. We don't want to as we said before, we don't want to take apart your book now because I'm encouraging people to go out and read it because it's a great read. So after that tour, you came back and you decided to retrain as a crew chief and a door gunner on, is it the UH-1 helicopter? Is that correct? Which is, if I'm right, that's sort of the iconic Huey from the Vietnam films. What made you do that? I mean, obviously it's a fantastic job, but what made you do that? And what was the training like?
In a weird kind of way, I wanted to, as you're walking around and carrying these heavy packs and, doing all this crazy stuff during different missions, you'd call in the helicopters and the jets for support to get you out of a pinch. And I always thought, wow, that's got to be the coolest job. One, you're not carrying, 100 pounds of crap on your back, breaking your knees and your lower back down, but you get to fly around, do your thing, and you go back and land on a big air base where everything, it's kind of like being in the government, everything's fancy because the officers don't want to live in the dirt and stuff like that, like in the infantry stuff. And then I wanted to save my knees and back. Well, the floor of those helicopters are not soft and easy on the knees at all. So that aspect was right out the window. But the training was absolutely incredible. Got to fly around in these helicopters, shoot rockets and guns. And, we knew the deployment was right around the corner, but it was just so much fun. And it was it was kind of like the Top Gun movie. Everything was like flying around and doing these aerial things where before you would be seeing these guys on the ground running around and you're like, not me anymore. I'm up here. And weirdly enough, come that 2010 deployment was kind of a nightmare scenario for me. The training was exceptional. I mean, there's nothing like diving in on this target. The rockets are firing, like literally 6 inches away from you, firing off the rocket pods, and you're sitting there with the machine gun firing. And, it's kind of like just being on the fastest roller coaster ever, but having a big machine gun. It was
like recruiting brochure stuff, really, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was the time of my life, and got to meet a lot of great people, and a lot of just cool events. We got to do.
So were you starting to enjoy life a bit more as a Marine at this point, or were you still being troubled in the background by sort of the oncoming train of PTSD?
I think I was definitely getting back into it, like really enjoying, like, okay, this is what I wish I would have been doing this the whole time. And, life became a lot better. It was easier to go out. And I don't know if it was new job, new training, constantly embedded in flying, maintenance, just whatever, that kept my mind so busy I didn't have time to think about it, or if it was I was really starting to, process things to where like, okay, you know what? Yeah, that was horrible, but here we go. I'm sure a lot of times the Halloween mask was still on during the day, and everyone was like, oh yeah, this guy came from the infantry, and he was a sniper and all this other stuff. Running into these pilots, one of the pilots happened to be roommates at one of the colleges with one of the officers that had died right toward the end of the '05 deployment. And he was like, "Oh, did you know this guy?" And, he wanted to talk about, how he was like back in college and all this stuff. And I'm just like, can I not get away from that side of things? And there was other events throughout the book that discuss that kind of stuff too. And I'm just like, you know what, there's nowhere I can go. But yeah, I mean, it was just like a thrill ride. It's like being a frat kid in college at a party, and flying around. We, did the flyover for a couple like football games there in California. During the national anthem, we'd fly over, got to fly up near cool scenic points along the beach. We'd fly, 50 feet off the water and like, doing all these like fun acrobatic type moves, up and over hills. And, you see all these people on the beaches taking pictures. And it was just cool. I mean, it was like a whole nother world that I never knew existed, but was so glad.
And you weren't being shot at.
Yeah, wasn't being shot at. Got to go hover up near the Hollywood sign, and people are taking pictures, and it was so cool that I thought, man, this is the life. If this is what the deployment's going to be, let's go.
So, Chris, you deployed to Afghanistan in 2010. Tell us about that tour. Talk us through it.
The deployment came, it was about 2 weeks before my birthday. We ended up deploying over to Afghanistan. We knew about deployment in the past. I was like, okay, it's going to be bad, but we're flying, we're going to be 1,500 feet above, way off the thing, and we're not actively going to be engaged. Well, we get over there, and the winter months are over. The rain, the mud, the snow, all that stuff that Afghanistan is known for was going to subside, and it's going to be, the summer months, which was always a great time when it's 150 degrees outside. And I think that's what's wrong with the people. It's just so hot, they just can't think straight. But we get over there, and the unit who we were relieving was like, man, it rained. There was dust storms. It was freezing cold. We didn't do anything. This deployment was boring. And I'm like, let's hope this deployment's going to be like that too. I was like, I'll take boring. One of the guys I actually, gone through some training with to become a crew chief was in that unit. One morning they were taking off in a sandstorm to go save a unit that was pinned down. The two helicopters collided, like not even 50 feet off the runway, ended up crashing just off the fence. All but him ended up dying. He was really messed up, but he was the only one of the 6 that survived. So he was sent home, lots of surgeries, lots of stuff. He's doing really good now, but for a long time, he was teetering on that edge where something needed to intervene, or he just couldn't deal with it. That he was the only one that walked away from the crash. Well, he didn't walk away, but that was kind of when we heard that, I was like, okay, this is not walking around, on the thing anymore. Things like this can happen. It doesn't happen a lot, but things like that can happen. Getting the deployment started, that unit left, we took over, kind of grabbed the torch and ran with it. Well, during that time, every morning you would start the shift. We were midnight to noon, and then the other shift was noon to midnight. I quickly learned, I knew we were going to be supporting units along the ground. That was our job to, fly support missions and things like that. But I had no idea who those units were going to be. As we started to get our briefs from the intel community, they're like, hey, you guys are going to be supporting 37, 27, 37, and 27 were the 2 units that I was with in Iraq. Now, those guys, where I still had a lot of close friends and officers that were leading, were in those units still on the ground fighting. So now it just became that much more personal, where I thought, oh, I'm meeting this guy's roommate from college. Cool, whatever. Now those guys are on the ground, and I'm like, everything just became more personal for me. And of course, during that time we had the Italians, we had the British up in Sangin. They were up there. We had the Georgians. We had all these different countries were down there as well. So I'm like, wow, okay, so we're kind of like the guardian angels maybe. And of course, we working close by with the medical evac teams and stuff like that, the helicopter hospitals and things like that. So it became very, very personal in a bad struggle, because for me, it was like we were flying 1,500 feet, which I'm like, yay, we're up here safe. Then you hear the stories of like, oh, this unit that I served with, actively engaged. There's, 3 guys that are wounded. There's, these guys are killed. And I'm like, oh, we need to get down there. We need to be, ground level. So I was really struggling. I'm like, you know what? I love this, but you know what? Kick me out of the helicopter. Let me go back there with these guys, so I can be with them. And again, not like I'm going to be the saving grace during any missions, but it was really hard to, first part, I was like, oh, I love flying back and landing and taking a hot, cold shower every night and, sleeping in a bed and things like that. And then on the other side, the angel on the left or whatever, I was like, oh, but they're down there taking all these losses. It was a bad.
Do you think, Chris, subconsciously you were chasing a bullet?
Yeah, I think so, because a lot of times, especially in the early deployments and in this deployment as well, I was like, you know what, these young guys, and I had to get over this through a lot of therapy and things like that, was, man, these young guys had their whole lives ahead of them. Here I am, 30s, I've had 30 years of life. These guys have only had 20. They could be the next doctors, lawyers, the cure for cancer. I mean, who knew? But I often always wrestled with, why did I make it back outwardly okay? Inwardly, it looks like a bad science experiment, like all the surgeries and things like that I've had to go through. But why them and not me, kind of thing.
And that is classic PTSD, isn't it? Survivor's guilt is classic PTSD, isn't it? And I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I'm not, I don't mean it like that. But that is a classic survivor's guilt. Is classic PTSD.
Yeah, it is.
100%. And it was. And it took me so long. And there's oftentimes, when I have a bad day or something is brought up about the deployment or something like that, or, bad day at work. Dang it, why didn't this happen over there? And this could have all been avoided. But then on the other side of it, we often tell each other, during that time, you know what? It's not about whether they made it back or not. Would they want you to be miserable and unhappy, or would they want you to live your life to the fullest and then live it that extra step for them, because they can't be here? So if you're going to have, one drink, have 3 drinks, because in celebrating those guys.
And I think it's interesting. I think for veterans, when you talk about your friends that you've lost on deployment, you never talk about the method of how they died. You talk about their character and what they were like. And I think it goes back to that celebration of life rather than celebration of death, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
So, Chris, that's a very hard chapter to read in your book. And again, I recommend people buy it to really fully understand the experience you went through. But once you came back from Afghanistan, your next posting was to recruit future Marines. And reading this chapter in your book, it was a very difficult time for you. Your PTSD started to raise its head again. You and your wife were going through a very difficult time. And you had a very unsupportive command structure. And I think a lot of veterans could probably identify with that.
So, Chris, you eventually secured a place at the Wounded Warrior Battalion. I've never heard of it. What is this organisation, and how did it help you?
When people come back and get hurt, or they're in need of medical treatment, whether that be surgery, treatment, processing out of the military, they're sent to the Wounded Warrior Battalion. It's a group where, like in a regular unit, your job is to train, deploy, come back, retrain, that kind of thing. The Wounded Warrior Battalion is set up to where your job is to get the care that you need, get the treatment. If you're, an amputee, you're going to be put through making sure everything is comfortable and fitted, your prosthetic. So it's more becomes the job of it's still being a Marine, but you're a patient now. You're not worrying about leading Marines, doing training, getting ready to deploy, things like that. Your job is now to focus on not your entire platoon structure, but it's actually where you can be selfish in a way and take care of yourself. And that was particularly
which is hard for a Marine, isn't it? Because there's a saying in the British Army: it's mission men and women, then me. The me always comes last. So the Wounded Warrior Battalion, you're essentially flipping that on its head. Is that correct? And was that quite difficult?
It was very difficult and absolutely correct. And for me, it was, these guys are burn victims, amputees. They might have only deployed for 2 months on their very first deployment where they've lost both their legs. And yeah, I've got, numerous deployments, but outwardly I'm fine. I don't have any, I'm not got all my fingers, toes, and arms, legs, and all that stuff. For me, I was like, I cannot be around these guys. These guys are amputees. I mean, here I am. And that was a big struggle for me, where I knew I needed treatment for the PTS. My back was messed up really bad. I mean, I couldn't run 50 yards without my back seizing up and falling on my face. So I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't process that, where I knew my thinking and my processing was really messed up too. And I'm like, maybe I'm just getting older. That's what it is. So I had a real hard time struggling. But as I was going through the medical appointments, and they're like, oh, yeah, you need to have back surgery. You need to have, sinus surgery, because all the Iraq and Afghanistan, all that gunk has got into your sinuses and basically blocked it off to where you can't like breathe normal. You're in your sleep. You stop breathing 20 something times. So that's a problem. You're maybe not going to wake up. And then as they do the neurological stuff, I guess from all the IEDs and IDF, after doing an assessment and stuff like that, they're like, wow, you have early signs of dementia at 35 years old because of all the concussions, TBIs. So as that information came to light, I'm like, okay, I do need to be here because the robot needs to be opened up and rewired, because the robot is inside me is messing up. It's malfunctioning.
And did they start dealing with your PTSD at this time? Were they looking after your body and your mind at this point?
It was more the body. During that time, because of the back and the body and the issues and the neurological issues, I couldn't drive because I had this bad twitch in my leg from, as it turns out, it was one of the discs in my back basically collapsed on a nerve and formed like 3 layers of scar tissue over the top of it. So my right foot would twitch. So I wasn't able to drive. So the surgeries were the front, because I was like, the mental stuff can wait. And after the surgeries were done, I was feeling better, but I didn't take into the account of what my wife was going through dealing with all my crap for the last 16, 17 years. And it took its toll on her. And, she ended up committing suicide. Thankfully, we were able to get her to the hospital, get her treatment, get her back on track. And now she's doing great. Then for me, it was like, okay, I can be a Marine again. I can take care of her. I don't need to worry about myself. And as we got her back good, I started declining again. And it was just a stupid, vicious cycle. But thankfully, shortly after that, I had a great command now, a great support team. And they were like, did the military thing, and they kind of grabbed you up and like, all right, you're done with this roller coaster ride. You're going to go, and kind of forced that you're going to go get help now. And whether you like it or not, you're going to get better. And I'm so glad that I had a command staff like that really put their foot, in the backside and like get.
And it was at that period, you say, that mentally with your PTSD, that was what set you off onto, you never fully recover on PTSD because it's always there, isn't it? But you learn to deal with it and live with it. So do you reckon at that point, that was when you started your being able to deal with what you'd gone through?
Yeah, I think that was the big thing. And at that point, I kind of knew you've had a great run, but it's kind of time to pass the torch and be done and kind of get on with life. I was really looking forward to leaving the military and seeing kind of what's next, what's the next chapter hold for me and my wife. But at the same time, I knew the clock was ticking, and I knew, July 31st, 2015, when the date of the medical retirement was fastly approaching. But I naively thought, because it becomes your life. Sunday you got a haircut. Monday through Friday you did whatever. Weekends, if you're lucky, you were off. But sometimes you were. That's your world. Once that door shut behind me in 2015, I was lost. I was like, what is this world? Like, what do I do now?
I think every veteran can identify that. Even if they've not had any combat experience, the very fact that you're leaving an organisation that looks after you 24/7. Well, define look after.
Well, you institutionalised, aren't you?
Yeah, you're institutional. That's exactly the word. You're institutionalised. You're on a set of railway tracks, aren't you?
Yeah.
And you just trundle along.
Yeah.
So you obviously made that move to civilian world, Chris, but what inspired you to write your book From Terror to Triumph? And did you find the process cathartic in any way?
Yes and no. Writing the book was actually really great looking back. During the writing of the book, I felt a lot of that sewage starting to boil back up that I thought I had processed and dealt with. And, kind of during the book, went back into some treatment for certain issues that arose by writing out these details. Maybe I'd hoped that I had forgot, but it was still very much, a part of it. But writing the book actually kind of happened in a way, kind of by accident with the whole COVID outbreak in 2020. I had just started my new job as a case manager with the Veterans Court. 3 weeks later, they're like, hey, COVID lockdown. Everyone's working remote. You're not allowed to be here. Go home. 3 weeks into a job and now I'm learning it by myself. This will be fun. And so I started sitting at home and I'm like, thinking about the deployments, thinking about the past stuff. And certain events started to the small details that I used to be able to like, oh, the wind was blowing. There's probably 20 leaves that blew across the road. A Coke can that started to fade a little bit. And I started worrying like, oh, if I don't get this down, I'm going to forget something. And that would be the worst sin, to forget an event that was so influential and impactful. So I started writing it all out and progressing through the timeline. And my wife was like, why don't you submit it to see if it becomes a book? And I'm like, yeah, right. Like I'm not a Stephen King. I'm not an author whatsoever. And she's like, no, just, whatever, just submit it and see what happens. So we submitted it. And then a few weeks later, the publication company came back and said, yeah, we're definitely interested in your book. We want to publish it. There's 1,000 books out there. Like if you go to the bookstore, Amazon or Google, war books or books on conflict A, B, or C, you're probably going to get, 8,000 like hits instantly. When I did that Google search though, I was like, where are the books about not the glory stuff, but
what Team 6 and
Lone Survivor, Heartbreak Ridge, Full Metal Jacket, all those whatevers. But even Full Metal Jacket in the 80s or 90s ends with them still like walking off to another battle. What is happening back here? Why is nobody talking about it? Why is no one talking about the PTS? Why is no one talking about the 22 a day or the guys that are killing themselves left and right?
Well, it's funny. I mean, I just want to drop some figures to listeners because, I consider myself up to speed on a lot of this stuff. But when I started looking into the situation with American servicemen and women, I was really taken aback. So, as you've already talked about there, Chris, around about 17 veterans a day commit suicide. Veteran suicide in America is twice the general population, and these are US Department of Veteran Affairs statistics. And between 2005 to 2018, 89,100 veteran suicides took place. I mean, that is shocking level.
Yeah, I mean, 80, and like we kind of discussed before, I think that number is grossly underestimated. I think it's a lot more, and the VA is doing the best that they can with the amount of people that are going back in, but they're so overworked that it's a treat and street type thing where they come in and like, here's all these pills, go, wait, we're doing our best we can. Let's get an appointment, as soon as we can. But hey, 3 months out, guys are in the parking lot of the VA hospital because they have nothing. They feel there's no hope. They ended up killing themselves in the parking lot of the place that's supposed to treat them. And and I think that was one of the reasons for the book as well, because thinking to myself, man, all these great books on conflict. Yay.
Yeah.
All the glory. Woohoo. They, jumped out in D-Day. But there's
nothing about the aftermath, though, is there?
There's nothing.
Picking up the pieces.
And there's probably medical books, but there's nothing like a firsthand account of, like, from a vet's perspective when they come home, that vicious cycle of redeploying. There's nothing out there. So I wanted to write a book that was going to, and I had to swallow a lot of pride and a lot of my ego and put out, like, hey, this is the reality. You may not like it, but this is why me or, Khalid or like anybody is, isolating away. This is why they're drinking so much. It's not because they're just reacclimating. They haven't drank in 7 months. They're coming back trying to process all these things, and pride and ego is, I think, the leading cause, besides the torment, but is a leading cause of the suicide rate, because there's so many resources out there that, and in the back of the book, I list, I think, like 20 or something like that. There's so much out there that can be helpful if you're willing to swallow your pride, admit, you know what, there is something wrong. I do need to get help. There's something that's clearly not right with me. But in the book, the biggest thing I put is it's okay to not be okay. Because if you go over there, well, just like the firefighters in Oklahoma, firefighters at 9/11, paramedics every day, I mean, firemen, police officers, whatever, like if they see some of the horrible things that we've seen, they've seen, whatever, and they're not somehow affected by something, like there's not an emotional thing where, yeah, you, like as a doctor, you have to kind of pull yourself out of the emotional piece, but you're not a robot. You're going to have some lasting thing. But if you don't, and you're just like, oh yeah, I picked up 10 kids, who cares, then go down to your nearest prison and please check yourself in, because you're a psychopath. And there's something.
Yeah, and I think every veteran, we've touched on PTSD in this podcast in various episodes quite a few times, and what you said there describes the sort of the journey that every veteran with PTSD is taking. It's the recognising it in yourself. There's no shame in it. Talk about it and get help.
So, Chris, how do listeners get a copy of your book? And also, have you any other points for veterans and steering towards help, or any top tip?
A little bit for the vets, and thankfully this book has helped a lot of people who have picked up the book, have read the book, has either generated, great things like this, being able to come onto a podcast and discuss things. I've had people who I haven't seen or talked to in 12 plus years contact me about, hey, this book has been amazing. I've given it to my sister-in-law whose husband is dealing with PTS, and she's now has a better understanding of what he's going through and how to help him. That makes it all worth it. I don't care if I sell a single book. If it helps 10 people get a better life, finish out their military career, anything I've put into the book or whatever is just icing on the cake. It absolutely, nothing is better or more heartfelt than hearing a success story based on the book that has helped someone else. And I think the biggest thing, if I can nail down, put every vet in one room and just shake them until they understand it, is that one part. It's okay to not be okay. There's no shame in seeking help. I think it takes a bigger person to not sit in a corner and drink yourself to death. And it takes a bigger man to actually, or bigger woman, to go and say, you know what, my experiences are relevant. I have a contribution to give. I'm not this monster. It's okay to not be okay. And for me, once I got that help, it was like this big, like, life is not as dark and depressing as I made it out to be. So for the book, you can either Google the title of the book and it pulls up about, 7 Google pages. If you punch in Terror to Triumph and with my name, it'll pull up about 6 or 7 pages of Google hits. It's all over Amazon, Target, Walmart, Kindle. If you like to read on your devices, I can't. I'm too, TBI. I can't focus on reading off a tablet. Recently been launched on what's called Audible here in the States. It's a audiobook. Now it's been fully published and it's on Amazon as well. If you just Google or go into Amazon and type in the book, it gives you the option for a paperback, Kindle version, or audiobook. And then there is also, if we can add it maybe as part, like in the description of the podcast, because it's just easier, www.terrortotriumphbook.com is going to actually be a website that I'm having created that's going to be specific to the book, which will also have blogs or vlogs, whatever you want to call it, where it's going to discuss, issues and be a platform for vets, families, and everything alike to, go on there, discuss topics, what's going on, how things are going against the grain for you. And that way it's a community to help each other. Because at the end of the day, veteran community is so small. If we can help each other, because it like we said, it's easier to talk, like you and I, Colin, it was easy to communicate. It may not be easy for, someone to go talk to just some random guy in the bar having a drink. But they'll open up to other vets, like best friends for life. And so I want to provide not only the book, but I want to provide a base for veterans. And my wife, who is a licensed military family therapist, she helps military families work through different issues. She's also going to have a spot on the website to where she's helping military families and spouses and kids and all that stuff on there as well. If we can't help each other, there's no stopping that 22 that number is just going to keep growing and growing. And we've got to do something to slow that down. And I think, this is one small step, but I think the impact that it's having, where it's getting people out of their comfort zone and allowing others to understand their loved ones, I think it's a dream come true. Like, I never thought in a million years I would be able to impact anything by just sharing my story. But I think I'm so far have helped others salvage their career, like get the help so they can do 25 years in the military if they want to, and realize that it's not a stigma where, in 05 it was a stigma. If you say, hey, I've got issues, you're going away. They don't have time to deal with that. But now, especially with Iraq's over, Afghanistan, we all know what's going on there. Now is the time to heal, to get you taken care of, and not lose sight of that bigger picture. And I think that's what the book has done.
Oh, that's great. And I think the other thing for people to take away from it is, you said there you're a published author now, and I think nobody thinks they can do that. But I think, veterans can do a lot more than they give themselves credit for. Do a podcast. Do it, write a book. It's there. When Kevin and I started doing this, we never thought we could do a podcast, but we've done it. You've
still
gone
can't.
one step, still can't, some would say. Yeah, but you've gone one step further and written a book, and I think it just shows you what people can do when they put their minds to it. And what we'll do, Chris, is we'll have all those links to your website and links to where you can get the book from as well. Awesome. So, Kev, this is your favourite part, mate.
As usual, we will finish with Desert Island Dits, in which our guest gives a choice of book, a film, and luxury item. So, Chris, over to you. What have you chosen for this episode?
I think for a book, if I can't take mine, I would love to take
Echo and Ramadi.
Echo and Ramadi, which was written by a really great guy who was in 2006 in Ramadi. He was an officer, and he does a lot of great. I think for the easy one, the luxury item, if I was on an island, I would definitely want to take like some survival stuff, like just a simple knife, but the kind where you can put all that stuff in. Different little tricks, you get the fishing line and the hook. That way you can catch some food. You soak some cotton balls in Vaseline and let them dry out.
And what would your film be, Chris?
The movie, I think it's just a film, and because I got to meet the guy and talk with him recently, I would take 13 Hours, the Benghazi story, because I'm good friends on social media, and I've went on his podcast. Chris Tonto Peranto, one of the guys that survived Benghazi, we've talked back and forth, and I've sent him a signed copy of the book and things like that. So I think I would take that, and a great guy who's doing great things as well.
I'm going to pick a book that I picked in Northern Ireland. We're going out in a cordon operation. We're going to be in trenches for like 10 days or whatever. And I was going through we had like I don't know what the Americans call it. We call it a naffy. It was a canteen area sort of thing. And I just literally went through a pile of books and I grabbed this book and I stuck it in my Bergen, my rucksack. And off we went, digging trenches for 10 days in the ground in Northern Ireland. And I pulled this book out, and it was called Sympathy For The Devil by Kent Anderson. And it's about a Green Beret in Vietnam, and it covers 2 tours of duty. And he did something similar to you, Chris. He did his first tour of Vietnam in Special Forces, came back, got out, had to join back up again. Very similar reasons as we discussed with you. He had trouble adapting to Civvy Street. He felt he was letting his friends down, and he wanted to get out there. There's a fantastic paragraph in it when he's comparing the rounds that countries use with their national character. And in it, he compares the American 5.56 to the AK-47 7.62 shot that the Vietnamese were using. And he says in the book, here's a standard American round. It's slim, lightweight, fast, but a bit unstable. It's the bullet equivalent of the fashion model. Sexy looking, thin and glittering. But if it gets dirty, damp or overheated, it's liable to jam on you. It's temperamental, a bit of a prima donna. Then he holds up an AK round and he goes, here's a Russian bullet. Short, thick, round in the middle. The peasant woman of bullets. Sturdy and slow, not easily deflected, dependable. Stick it in the mud, put it in the gun, and it'll always shoot. So we are shooting our fashion models at them, and they are firing back with peasant women. I thought that was an absolutely fantastic description there. So Kent Anderson, he joined the Merchant Navy at 19. He then in 68, he enlisted in the US Army, passed Special Forces selection, and went out and did those tours. And when he came back, he joined the police. And very similar again to you, he wrote a book But just prior to that, he went and got a Master of Fine Arts in Fiction from the University of North Carolina, and after that he wrote his fiction, he was a fact-based book, but he wrote a fiction-based book. Again, another military guy writing about what he experienced. So Kev, what would you pick?
I haven't chosen a book this week.
God, you're breaking tradition, you can't do that.
I can't, I've done it. It was a book, and strange enough, it was written in 1954 or 58, a book called Red Alert. But how it was known as a film was Dr. Strangelove, directed by Stanley Kubrick, filmed in 1964 in the UK. At the height of the Cold War, it's a really good black comedy satirising this period between the tension between the USSR and the USA. Peter Sellers plays about 4 parts in it. Absolutely stunning parts.
I think Chris is probably too young to have seen this.
Well, I think everyone should see it.
Not everybody's as old as us, mate.
You're older than me. Anyway. And also, George C. Scott, who played Patton, very straight actor. He plays a comedy part as well. Absolutely superb. I won't spoil it. Go and watch it. It talks about, obviously, mutual assured destruction, or MAD, as it was known. And it has a great scenario. And
I'll tell you what, Chris, as a special reward to Chris for coming on the podcast and being generous with time, Chris, after this podcast, we'll get your address off you and we'll send you a copy, a DVD of Dr. Strangelove.
Dr. Strangelove, absolutely.
That'd be awesome. That'd be great.
Yeah. And then you could write back and go, that was the worst film I ever saw.
I do believe it's one of the top 100 films recognised in the world, as in...
Well, we'll have to get Chris's feedback on that one. Okay, mate, thanks for that, Kev.
Well, thank you again, Chris, for coming to us on this podcast. And thank you, the listener, for your continued support and suggestions. Please keep them coming. And our email and social media links are at the bottom of our show notes. You will find us on all the usual suspects: Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. You can write to us via postcards, letters. I'll accept it all. And if you have downloaded us from iTunes or Spotify and like the podcast, it'd be great if you could leave us a good review. Bad reviews, don't bother.
Yeah, don't bother.
And then anywhere where you get your podcast from.
Yeah.
No, we don't need bad reviews. And thanks again to Nick Beale for his continuing support and sponsorship to this series and offering technical support through his company, ISAR. See you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.